So yeah, she was left on rubble, right? And Soren's kind of looking after her, but Kwan wants to do her own thing. She wants to go back to Madrigal to rally her people against this Venture dude who sucks. And Soren is just like, I don't want to do that. And Kwan's like, well, I'm going anyway. And it's like, well, Chief told me to look after you, so I guess I'm going with you, but I won't do it without a fee, I guess. And yeah, so I guess I'll only let you go if you're going to pay me, I guess. I can't remember exactly what happened, sorry. But anyway, it's like Kwan says, well, don't worry about payment because I'll give you everything that you want in deuterium or deuterium money. And it's like, when you do the job, you get me to where I want you to be, you'll get all the payment you want, I guess. And there's a few times where Soren says, well, what about the fee we agreed upon? But they never actually agree upon a fee. And it's just like, they would have worked that out, right? Soren would figure out, like, what's the precise amount that I'm doing this gig for? But it never gets established. But then in future scenes, Soren references the fact that they did establish how much it was, but they never specify the amount. But conveniently at the end, Soren finds a box of like parts or whatever that it's basically money, and he's just like, oh, this is more than enough. And it's like, that's handy, I guess. Great. Problem solved. The screenwriter didn't have to do much there. And whatever. We see a flashback of Kwan with her like family, and she has this argument with her family at the dinner table where she's like, if you want to feed your friends, stop feeding them lies, something like that. I can't remember, but it's just like a moment where, an example of writing where the character is unnaturally waxing poetically about something, where it would be more believable if they just talked in a straightforward way that got to the heart of what they were feeling, rather than just like trying to come off in this poetic way. Like, it's unnatural. People don't talk like that, you know? So some of the dialogue is overwritten at times, and there's just some lazy setups and payoffs. There's a character that they name Squirrel, the writers, and he's like an affiliate of Soren's, and he's on Rubble. And Rubble's talking to Squirrel, and Squirrel's kind of this like shady character who's like kind of on Soren's side, kind of not, I think. And Soren sees that he's kind of being a bit uppity, I guess, and Soren calls him out on it, and he's just like, oh, it looks like Squirrel's finally decided to gather his nuts, or something like that. And it's just like, ugh. Is that why you named them Squirrel? Just so you could have this stupid line? The show overall, I think, has a problem too with like balancing its storylines. It's not nearly as sophisticated as something like Better Call Saul, for instance, which does a pretty good job of balancing the screen time between Better Call Saul. Fuck. I said Better Call Saul as if that was his fucking name. First name Better, last name Saul, middle name Call. No. Jimmy McGill. So you have Jimmy McGill and Mike Ehrmantraut primarily. There's a lot of different characters, but those are the two main characters that kind of divide the two worlds of like criminality and lawfulness, that kind of both serve to illustrate the full picture of that criminal world that Better Call Saul tries to portray. And that show does overall a much better job of balancing the two storylines across each episode than Halo does, because like with episode 8 of Halo season 1, the entire episode is Kwan, and Chief is nowhere to be found. It completely neglects Chief's storyline. Not the penultimate episode, but I think the third to last episode, it's just all Kwan, and it just kind of sucks, you know, because you know the whole time most of the audience is waiting for the Chief beat in that episode, and it never comes. Well, it kind of does, but it sucks because it's like a dream sequence, and Kwan goes on this like spirit journey. So okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Soren escorts Kwan back to Madrigal, and she has this whole journey where she's trying to rally her people against her oppressors, but they're not willing to do it, and then she's fighting these assassins and stuff. and she gets separated from Soren, and she goes off and does her own thing, and she like goes out into the desert to find these like mystical people or whatever, so she can have some kind of spirit journey and figure out what her mission in life is or something. And she finds these people out in the desert who give her some drugs. And she starts having these visions where she's fighting Chief. And I feel like they just did that for the promotional material, where they can put that out as like a teaser, like clip it out of context and be like, you gotta tune in for the next episode because Quan is fighting Master Chief. Ugh, what's going on there? To make you think like, oh, maybe there's some overall narrative purpose to Chief fighting Quan, whatever that might be. But then you watch it and it's just like, oh, it's just a dream sequence spurred on by hallucinogenic whatever she's taking. And it's meant to teach her some lesson, I guess, about how rage alone can't win you a battle. I assume that's the lesson of the thing. But it doesn't even seem that she absorbs that lesson at the end, because like she tries to fight Chief a few times and she gets killed. We don't see her getting killed, but the screen just kind of goes black a few times, and then it cuts back to her kind of resetting like it's a video game. And they're like, try again. And she fights Chief some more, and he keeps beating the shit out of her. And then eventually, like, he stops fighting her, and just she's on the ground kind of exhausted, and he just kind of holds out his hand for her to take, like he's helping her up. And she takes his hand. And then it just skips to the next phase without confirming that Quan absorbed this lesson. It's just like, you're left kind of wondering as an audience member, like, what was the point of that? And then she goes out and finds this well. A monitor comes out of it, and I guess that's where the portal is that leads to the Ark, which, if you're a fan of the games, there is a portal on Earth that leads to the Ark, which is kind of this space installation that controls all the Halo arrays all at once. It has, or the Halo array. There's one array, and it's composed of a number of Halo installations, at least 7, I think. And if you get to the Ark, you can fire all the Halos all at once. And eventually that's what they try to do. The Covenant, they try to do that in Halo 3 in the games. But in Halo 1, Halo Season 1 of the show, all we know so far is that the portal to the Ark, maybe it leads to the Ark. It could just lead to one of the Halo installations or somewhere else. All we know is that we know she's looking for a portal, and there's probably a portal in the well that is depicted in the vision that Quan has, but we don't know where it goes yet or what that's going to mean later down the line. And she learns she like has this reuniting with her father, and then I kind of forget what the point of it was, like what the lesson was ultimately that she drew from all that, but she decides she has to go to the place it all began because the outpost where the fight happened in the premiere episode has some significance for some reason, so she decides to go there. And then Soren goes with her. Soren catches up with her, I guess, and then he follows her there. And then Vinsher kind of closes in and surrounds them, and they have this big fucking dumb video game fight with Vinsher and his men. And that's where Quan finds Chief's assault rifle that he threw in the premiere episode, and then it cuts back to Master Chief, and it's just like, okay, it's like now we're back in business. But it's a shame because, again, like, I got nothing against that actress who plays Quan. It's just a shame that that character was so underdeveloped, underwritten, and just isn't that compelling or interesting. And I wonder what the format is going to be going forward. If, like, because obviously Chief is going to be consistent throughout all the seasons. Hopefully he'll be in all the episodes now going forward, and not just, have a few episodes here and there that don't even have him at all. I think that would be a mistake. But I think what they might do is Chief will be a consistent main character, and then the secondary character will change from season to season as if it was an anthology, kind of like True Detective, where it follows different characters each season. that will be kind of how they do it with Halo, except that will only apply to the secondary ancillary characters, right? So like Quan or McKee, for instance. McKee got killed off, I think, at the end of this season. Quan is, I don't know if they'll touch, I guess they will go back to her because they got to address the portal, right? So, and the portal is on Madrigal where she is. So they'll probably have, now that I think about it, they'll have her do something with that. I think they try to make up for the fact that Chief is absent from the Quan episode by having these overly flashy kind of, I don't know if it's done with a drone or a crane, but there's some VFX involved. There's like this one transition shot where it's like you see the desert, and in one shot without cutting, the camera pans over to Vincher's truck he's riding in, and then the camera pushes in and it goes through the front windshield. And I think practically the front windshield must not have been there, and the camera is just passing through nothing. And then the glass pane is added in VFX to make it seem like the camera is passing through it. But I feel like that just comes off as a little too unnecessarily flashy and overcompensatory. Is that a word? For the fact that Chief is not in the episode. So they're trying to be flashy in other ways to make up for it, and it just doesn't work. They do another shot like that where it's like bird's eye view on the tent of the people of that Quan finds out in the desert. It like does this huge push in from space, and it pushes in on the tent, and it keeps going down, 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 and then it kind of, the camera tilts up so it's like flush with the horizon, and then the camera kind of goes through the tent roof and then pans down into the tent, and you see everybody. And it's just like, we didn't need these transitions. This is too, like, you're only having them in this episode, and it feels too obvious that this is just to compensate for the lack of Chief, and it's just not working, so don't bother. And it just sucks me out of it anyway, because I feel like it's too much. It's overindulgent, you know. There's this funny moment with Vincher where he's closing in, him and his men are closing in on Quan and Soren on the base, the Madrigal outpost. And they come across a bunch of dead elites. And there's this one elite in particular. There's this one shot where Vincher is kind of standing over an elite, and it's a low angle shot. You see the elite corpse in the foreground. You see Vincher in the background, or in the focus, I guess. And he's looking down at the corpse, and he's smoking a cigar cartoonishly, and he's like, "Those the aliens, eh? Ugly bastards." And then he takes another puff of his cigar and he walks away out of the shot. And it's just like, it's almost like a middle finger to the audience who want to see more aliens, but they're stuck with Vincher, stupid Vincher, cardboard, one-dimensional Vincher, and his one-dimensional cardboard bad guy army. And it's just like, there's the corpse of the more interesting enemy, and it's just like, too bad, you're stuck with me and my dumb soldiers. It's like, why aren't there more aliens? Why are we stuck with these uninteresting flat characters? So anyway, back to Chief and McKee and the UNSC and all that whole storyline. McKee and Chief have Segsy time. Segggsy. Segsy time. And it's weird because it doesn't feel earned. It feels like it happens too quickly. It wasn't a shock to me personally, as it seemed to be to everyone else. Everyone was just like, no way, they did that. And I was just like, I kind of saw it coming in a way. I mean, I don't know if it was going to be a sex scene, but I figured they were at least going to like kiss or something. Because they did the kissing thing when she was a kid with the other boy kid, right? And then it's like you have this male character on the UNSC side. You have this female human character on the Covenant side. McKee says she's going to bring the aliens the demon's head. It just seems kind of obvious to me that the writers are going to turn that on its head and be like, oh, these characters are going to get together and surprise, quote unquote, they're going to like not only get along, but they're going to have they're going to kiss and have sexy time. And it didn't really come as a huge surprise to me. I mean, I did roll my eyes. It was just like, fuck, they are doing it, you know? But it didn't come as a shock. And they do this weird thing where Cortana watches the whole thing. She watches the sexy time. And I don't know if they're trying to do some eatable thing, because Cortana is obviously based, at least partially, on Halsey's personality. And Halsey is obviously like something of a mother figure, not his biological mother, but a mother figure to John. And so it's like Halsey is watching her son have sex by proxy via Cortana, and it's unclear what she's feeling, but Cortana is obviously upset, and maybe that's meant to mirror what Halsey would feel if she was watching it. And it's like, are they trying to hint at some attraction that Halsey has to Chief, hence the Oedipal thing? Or is it just something unique to Cortana, where Cortana kind of is looking at Chief and is saddened by the loss of his innocence because he's losing his virginity or something? Or because she's partially like jealous because Cortana can't fill the same role as McKee is as like a lover? Like, I don't really know what they're doing with that. It just came off as a little too like weird and too left up to the audience's interpretation, where it's just like, what is the audience meant to make of that? It's like, I don't really know. And she has this conversation with Halsey immediately after, where it's just like his serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine levels are all elevated, and it's just like, yeah, no shit, he just had sex, he's in love. Like, that's the chemicals in the brain that get elevated when it's associated with sex and love and that sort of thing. I feel like that's just the writers going like, hey, look at me, I know psychology, I know brain chemicals, like, look at all the stuff I know. It feels like that's all that is. And because you wouldn't need to tell somebody like Halsey what chemicals in the brain are activated after a situation like that. You know, it's just like she would know that already. So like with Quan at the beginning with her friends talking about deuterium, that's another example of like over expository dialogue, where that's not a natural conversation that she would actually have with her friends. And it's like, it's just for the audience's sake, so they understand what the MacGuffin is, right? In the case of Quan, it's the fuel. And it's just like, in the case of Cortana and Halsey, it's just like the writers letting the audience know how smart and well-versed they are in psychology, I guess. I don't know. It's stupid. There's a beat where the UNSC, they have McKee, they're like interrogating her, and they have her in the same room as the artifact, which is just like, what are you doing? Like, this is a Covenant spy. Like, why do you keep forgetting this? Why do you still not have this in mind? And why would you have her in the same room as that artifact? You wouldn't have her anywhere near that fucking artifact, because you don't know how she's going to react to that. Because, like, you can't... They already know that Chief is reacting to it in a unique way. And I think they must know... They probably know that she has... I can't remember what exactly they know in regard to, like, what effect the artifact has on McKee, and whether they know that McKee and Master Chief share this genetic deformity that makes them blessed ones. I honestly can't remember what the UNSC knows at this point. But it's just stupid that they would even take that risk of having her in the same room as the artifact. And surprise, surprise, McKee touches the fucking artifact, and the artifact creates, again, convenient shockwaves that just manifest whenever the plot dictates that it's useful to have shockwaves to repel certain characters. In this case, it's the UNSC guards, so McKee can grab the artifact and run away with it. And it's just lazy writing. And all it took for McKee to change her allegiance from humans back to... Because the Segsy time made her value humans more. And I guess the audience is meant to think that she's on the human side now. But then the UNSC guards, they tase her, and that reminds her of her being tased by the cartoonishly evil guards that she was being tased by on the whatever garbage stupid planet that she was on. And then she's just like, I hate humans again, and Covenant is my friend now. One beat I kind of liked was Cortana is forced into a position where she has to choose between the interests of the UNSC and the interests of John, like getting to the bottom of like his visions and the stuff he's feeling with McKee and the artifact and all that. And she decides to go with John, and she favors him now. And it's just like, why didn't she do this before? I guess before it was to, like when Cortana shut down the neural link, it was to prevent Halsey from getting hurt in that instance. Cortana couldn't take that risk. So I guess now that Halsey's life is not in direct jeopardy, then she has the wiggle room to like side with John on this matter, and she decides to give John a heads up because John is trying to like escape the facility to go find McKee, but the UNSC don't want Chief to leave, I think. So Halsey's trying to stop him and use Cortana to do it, but Cortana's like, no, I believe in John. I believe in what he's doing. Which I kind of like that, to be honest. I just think the execution around it kind of is lame. But then they have this fight. Chief fights 2 Spartans. Not fully armored Chief. He's like in his under armor, and he's fighting 2 fully armored Spartans, and he's like winning. And I think that annoyed some people because it's just like, how can he take on 2 Spartans? And he's like, he doesn't even have his full suit. But at the very least, Cortana is giving him a tactical advantage. She's like accessing nearby computers, like a warthog, for instance, and she drives it into, I think, one of the Spartans. I can't remember. She does something with a warthog. And she's also accessing the other Spartan suits in real time and analyzing their like diagnostic information and their weak points. And she's telling that information to Chief and telling him where to strike them on their body to like maximally weaken them. And so I think you can say like, well, at least Cortana is giving him the edge. Like that's the reason why him, without his complete suit of armor, he has the edge over these 2 Spartans he's fighting simultaneously, is because Cortana is feeding him this information in a way that, like, the Spartans he's fighting, they don't have an AI system where they're getting information fed to them in regard to like how to strike Chief to like, you know, impair him. So that didn't really bother me too much. I kind of like the fight scene. I like the impacts, like the punches, the blows when Chief is getting hammered by that one Spartan dude. I like the impacts of that, flying into walls and stuff. I thought that was okay. They do this stupid thing with the non-Chief Spartans, like Kai, Vanek, and Riz, I think are the 3 of them. There's 4 altogether. Chief is like team leader, silver team. And then the 3 Spartans are Kai, Vanek, and Riz. And Kai has taken her pellet out, but the others haven't. She's like opened herself up to all these emotions and stuff, and this like way of reasoning and thinking about the situation where she sees what Chief's trying to do and she wants to help him, but they've been given conflicting directives, or they've all been given one directive by Halsey, but Kai kind of sees what they should really be doing, but the other Spartans, they still have their pellets in. I forget the orders that were specifically given, but Kai is acting against the interest of the other Spartans, and the other Spartans see this weird, peculiar behavior that she's exhibiting because she doesn't have the pellet. And they knock her out, and they tie her to this relatively flimsy stone bench. Not flimsy, but it's just like, it's so small, and we already know the Spartans are so strong that she's obviously just going to break out of that, especially in context of that episode where earlier in the same fucking episode, they have a montage of Kai doing these feats of strength where she lifts these huge, like, she lifts like a giant engine from something, a pelican maybe, and then she lifts like a giant warthog or something. And the beat is obviously meant to convey the idea that she's really strong, right? And so now when we see her tied to this bench, it's like obviously she's going to break out of that. So there's no tension, right? There's no dilemma where the audience is just like, oh no, she's stuck there forever. It's like the audience obviously isn't thinking that. The audience is thinking she's going to get out. It's just a matter of time. And it's just like, why even have those feats of strength earlier in the episode? And the whole thing is just very stupidly executed. And she obviously breaks out, and then she goes to help Chief. There's a shot where Kai is like chasing after this pelican that's trying to fly away. I think Halsey and Creepy Scientist Man are on it. And it does this weird VFX thing where it's like, if you've ever used Blender or 3D Studio Max or Maya or any one of these like 3D modeling programs, you'll understand that you create objects and you can create a camera that you can treat as a viewport, and you can render images through that camera entity. And the camera is kind of like an object, but a bit different. It has its own unique properties, particularly in that it can be viewed through as a viewport. But I think what is happening with the VFX shots is that the camera is being linked to the subject in terms of like relative position and just position. So like X, Y, and Z coordinates. They are locked relatively onto the same position of the thing that it's linked to. If you were to like mouse click and drag over top a camera and an object in a program like Blender, right, and group them together, and then you move the object around, the camera moves along with it to the degree that it is offset in terms of position from relative to the object that it's linked to. So like you move the camera, the object moves with it. You move the object, the camera moves with it. And it's just like, I feel like that's what they did with some of the VFX shots, including this one, where they link the camera to Kai or a specific portion of her armor. I'm guessing probably the torso piece. And so the camera, like Kai's body as she's running, is doing this kind of rotation and position adjustment, right? And the camera is kind of sharing all those movement and rotational properties. So it's moving along with a particular portion of her armor, right? And so overall, it's keeping Kai centered in the frame in a way that seems unnatural, because you can't execute a shot like that in a practical way. Like if you were to shoot that with a real camera, you can't actually lock a camera like that 100% onto a subject and expect the camera to go with it. I mean, you have to move the camera yourself if it's a practical camera. But you can do something like that with a VFX camera. The problem is, you don't want to do that with a VFX camera because that gives away the fact that it's a VFX shot and it's not real, right? So what I think it should have done is give the camera its own natural path and practical positioning as if it were a real camera. And then that way you the audience loses the sense of like, is this shot real? Is this shot fake? This is actually pretty convincing. And if you can convince the audience that the shot is real, you win, right? That's great. That's what you want. You don't want the audience to know that a VFX shot is a VFX shot if you can avoid it, right? But a lot of directors, showrunners, whatever, VFX artists, they can't resist the fucking compulsion to have the VFX camera behave in an unrealistic way that gives away the fact that it's not a real shot. And it just sucks the audience out of it. It's just like, do it in a practical way where you can't tell if it's real or not. That's what you want to do. But no, with shots like this shot of Kai chasing the pelican, they fix the camera directly onto Kai. They keep her in the center of the frame in this unrealistic way. And so the camera's kind of moving around like this, but it's rotating a little bit to always keep her directly in the center of the frame. But the problem is, on top of that, they add all these like motion blur effects to it. So everything around Kai looks smudgy as fuck and shaky and stuff. But Kai is the one thing that's looking weirdly like stationary and not smudgy in relation to everything else. And it just doesn't look right. Anyway, Kai boards the Pelican and then finds Halsey, creepy scientist man. Creepy scientist man tries to like take out Kai, and Kai gets pissed off, and then the audience knowing that he is a creepy guy, Kai now has the green light to kill this dude in a brutal way, where the writers can write this scene and then the audience won't be dismayed. They can be just like cheering it on because it's like, yay, creepy guy is dead. And it's just such a shallow payoff. And it makes you wonder, like, is that the whole reason that that character was there, just to have this gruesome death? Not that it was that gruesome, but just like, you know, in any other situation, a Spartan wouldn't do that to another human being unless they had good reason. And it's just like, they made him creepy, and then Spartan kills creepy guy, and that's it. And it's just like, that's his arc. That's it. Like, great, I guess. Like, why not, if you're going to have a character like that, why not make him way more interesting? Give him more things to do. Make him more complex. Not needlessly creepy just for the sake of a cheap death at the end. Like, what is it you're trying to say with this character? Give him more substance, you know? I don't know. So a bunch of stuff happens. And Chief finds himself on a ship chasing down McKee and the artifact, because McKee has brought the artifact to this like holy planet where a bunch of other Covenant aliens are, and they want to unite the artifacts or plug the artifact into something that's already there on the Halo, the holy planet, whatever it is. They plug the artifact in, and it's going to paint like a star map, and it's going to show where Halo is located, wherever it is in the universe, right? So that's McKee's plan. And the Prophets want this. They've been waiting for the artifact. McKee's delivering it, and now Chief is pursuing McKee and the artifact, and Chief, along with Silver Team, they're all in the same team now, and they're like united in this like fight that they're about to have on this holy planet, trying to get the artifact back, I guess. And Chief and Cortana have this beat in the cockpit that's actually pretty awesome, and it's just like this one glimpse, an example of like a glimpse of like what the original Halo property was in the games, where it's just like, oh, that's the Halo I want. Where has this Halo been? And then it's just there for like a split second, and then it just kind of goes away again. And it's a shame, because it's just like, the beat I'm talking about is where Chief is in the cockpit of the Pelican. I think they're traveling through slip space at this point. And he's talking with Cortana, who's kind of being projected on the dashboard of the cockpit. And they're talking to each other, and Cortana makes a joke. And Chief laughs. He appreciates the joke. And you see that, oh yeah, he still has a sense of humor. And Cortana has a sense of humor. And they have a mutual kind of comedic back and forth. And it's like, I recognize that from the games, and that's awesome. And it's like, I guess it took a while for the show to build to this, but I'm glad we finally got here. And it's like, this is something from the games that is awesome, and I'm glad we're finally here. But then it doesn't really, that's like the one moment where it felt really like Halo, but then it doesn't, it's just quickly gone again. What I liked about the finale, the last episode, episode 9 overall, is that the show, it felt like the show finally decided to take itself a little less seriously. And I think the show sorely needs more levity and humor in it. Not at the cost of the plot or the themes or like the seriousness of like war and conflict and death and all that. You don't have to detract from any of that in the injection of further levity and comedy, I don't think. But there's an exchange after the exchange with Chief and Cortana where they're all in the cockpit, all the other Spartans, Cortana, Chief, and the other Spartans. They're in the cockpit, And Cortana has this dialogue about them all being spaghettified. There's a risk that they will all be spaghettified going through some portal or whatever in order to get to the Holy Planet. And the Spartans are like freaking out, and the Cortana's like, well, I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't want to freak you out, but I'm telling you now. And the dialogue doesn't really make sense, but I did find the scene quite funny. And I just appreciated the sudden levity. And I think the reason I liked it was because it felt like I was watching Red Dwarf again. You know, like in mid to late season Red Dwarf, where they're all in Starbug and they're having some comedic exchange, all the crew members and Holly, who's on the computer.
Too small for a vessel, maybe some kind of missile.
It's impossible to tell at this range. Whatever it is, they clearly have a technology way in advance of our own.
So does the Albanian State Washing Machine Company.
Step up to red alert.
Sir, are you absolutely sure? It does mean changing the bulb.
It felt a lot like that. And I liked that it made me feel like I was watching Red Dwarf. But then I thought about it and I was just like, well, it shouldn't feel exactly like Red Dwarf, because Red Dwarf is not trying to be what this show is trying to be. Halo is supposed to be, or is trying to be, a grounded sci-fi action thriller. Red Dwarf was like an action comedy, right? So like comedy is really strongly a part of that show's DNA in a way that it isn't with Halo. So it shouldn't be like Red Dwarf, but it reminded me of Red Dwarf, and that's why I liked that beat, even though the dialogue didn't make much sense. Because why would Cortana say these things to worry the crew needlessly? Like, it just doesn't make sense if you analyze the logistics of what's being said. But anyway. McKee is on the Holy Planet. They're plugging the artifact in. They're about to find out where Halo is. The prophets are there. There's some grunts and I think some maybe elites. I think it's just grunts initially. They're just like they're standing guard. And the Spartans land down and they stealthily take out the grunts, and one Spartan like snipes a couple grunts, and it's another one of the rare beats throughout this first season of television where it felt like the games, you know. And I wanted a lot more of that than we got throughout the whole season. And I liked some of the action in the finale set piece, because like they land and then they take out the grunts, but then it's just like Cortana's just like, oh shit, Chief, there's a bunch of other enemy signatures. They're fast approaching because there's a shitload of aliens that were just like sitting underground waiting, and now they're coming. And it's like, oh shit. And then there's all these aliens, there's grunts, there's brutes, there's elites. There's no hunters still, I don't think. I don't remember there being any. There certainly weren't any fight scenes with them. But Chief fights a bunch of elites and brutes and stuff, and at first glance, I didn't have a problem with the fight scenes. Like, the CGI kind of looks, again, sometimes okay, sometimes it's like PS2 cutscene graphics. But if you analyze it, like if you go frame by frame, because I watched the fight scenes again, and I was like pausing it quite a bit, and like analyzing the fights beat for beat. And there's moments where brutes are just like swinging their hammers at nothing, and it's just like you would miss that easily if you were just to watch the fight scene for the first time and let it wash over you, and you're just like, that was all right. But then you like analyze it frame by frame, and you're just like, wait, that's stupid, you know? It's just like brutes swinging their hammers at nothing, because it wasn't written in the script for Chief to dodge some move. And so when they're adding the brutes and the hammer swings in post-production, it's just like, we got to stage all the action based around Chief's movement, what was filmed on camera. But obviously they didn't pay much attention to that, since they just have the brutes do these swinging motions where Chief isn't even there in front of them. And it's just like, you know, forcing action where it just makes no sense for the brutes to be doing that. And it's like a dumb thing that they hope people will not notice because it'll go by so fast, but it's there and it's dumb if you look closely enough. This one brute kind of gets the upper hand over Chief and is like crushing his head. Meanwhile, McKee is approaching the artifact and she touches it again, and again the artifact has the magical ability to do whatever the fucking plot demands, and it sends out more convenient shockwaves that only knock the Spartans off their feet, but all the aliens get blown clear off the platform. And it made me laugh out loud because it made me think of, like, this is basically just the screenwriter getting a brush and dustpan and just kind of brushing the whole surface of that Holy Planet set piece and going, okay, we don't need you hundreds of aliens anymore. We're good now. We just need this skeleton crew of, like, the Spartans and McKee and the Prophets now. Like, you are just, like, useless, so go away, please. There's this dumb thing with, like, Chief. He allows himself to die so Cortana can completely overwrite his brain and give him the 100% efficiency, killing efficiency of a computer in order to get himself out of the situation alive because he's surrounded by aliens. Not only that, but also extract the artifact and get his friends out alive. He can't save McKee at this point because McKee has been killed. I think she gets killed by touching the artifact. So Cortana tells Chief can't, based on his own ability as a human being, can't get everyone out alive and get the artifact out safely. But if he dies, which is a precondition for Cortana overwriting his brain for some reason, that hyper efficiency that he will then have will be enough to get him and his friends and the artifact out of there safely. And so he decides to do that. But it's dumb because the way he sacrifices himself, he just, like, gives himself up to a brute with a hammer, basically, and he's just hoping that the brute will hit him with the hammer in such a way that it will kill him without, not just knock him unconscious, but kill him in a way that won't damage his bones or his internal organs. It will still preserve his body enough that when Cortana then overwrites his brain, that she will be able to take full advantage of his body and fight the aliens, right? Because, like, what if the brute hit him hard enough to kill him, but it also, like, crippled him, or he lost a limb, or crushed his rib cage or something? Then if Cortana overwrote his brain and tried to control his body, it wouldn't even be worthwhile, because what can Cortana do with a broken body, right? So Chief is leaving too much up to chance there, you know? How can he be sure that the brute is going to kill him in the right way, quote unquote, right? It just doesn't make sense. And you know he's dead because they do this thing with the sound design where you hear, it cuts to like a first person, like, in helmet shot, and then you hear the sound design where you hear this, like, beeping and flatlining, right? Which is a sound that's always associated with a character death, right? You hear the beep, you know that person has died. And it's like, okay, they're dead. Well, what does that mean? So Cortana overwrites his brain, but it's like, how does that revive him exactly? Like, what is it that's making Chief, like, awaken? Like, what is it about the hammer impact that has made his body shut down? I don't understand. Because it's specifically that Cortana is controlling his body, not the suit, right? Because remember, Cortana is a brain implant, and he needs to die in order for her to take over his body. So it's not that she's controlling the suit. She's controlling his body. She's possessing his brain. And so Chief is just hoping that he's left after the conflict with the brute that kills him. Chief is just hoping that his body is left in a condition that will be optimal for Cortana to take control of and use optimally in a way that will get them out of that situation. But it works, thankfully, because the screenwriters wanted it to, and Chief takes out all the aliens with, like, robot level efficiency, except for the fucking Prophets, which are like if you're gonna kill aliens, those are the ones to kill, right? But they're just fucking floating there watching him as he leaves with the artifact, and that's dumb. It's one of those beats where I respect what they're doing thematically, like, because what they're doing is like it ties into the theme of what is the cost of humanity at the individual level in winning the war. I think I talked about this earlier, where it's like, you know, he lets Cortana completely overwrite his personality, overwrite his brain, and he fights with robot level efficiency. And if he wins the war, but it's at the cost of robbing Chief completely of his humanity, where he has literally none of it left, can you really call that a victory, right? When isn't the whole idea to preserve our humanity, but then we end up doing the exact opposite. So I respect the thematic of it, but the execution is really clumsy and not well thought out. And but they at least do this thing where they use the death of McKee to accentuate the coldness or the lack of emotion that Chief now has or doesn't have. I'm not phrasing it well, but you know what I mean. Like, Chief is now, he's totally unfeeling, and all the segsy time that he had with McKee no longer even matters. Like, that doesn't even factor. He doesn't feel anything. He doesn't care that she's dead now, and it's sort of bouncing off of that prior relationship and segsy time with McKee to now state that Cortana has taken over now, and now he's completely machine and he feels nothing. And John Halo, I guess, is now actually a robot. And Halo remains a mystery. Even at the very end of Season 1, we still don't know much about Halo in the context of the television show. We obviously know what its purpose is in the games, and the whole Halo array and stuff, but it's unclear as to what the writers have in mind for Halo, and I feel like at least at the end of this first season, we should have seen Halo. I feel like at the very least, the last shot of Halo Season 1 should have been basically the opening cutscene to the first game, Halo Combat Evolved, where they jump through slip space, Pillar of Autumn finds Halo, and it's like, oh shit, there's Halo. Have the last shot be Halo. Like, the camera could pan from the Pillar of Autumn to Halo. Then you just hold on that for a few seconds and then cut to black credits. That could be the end of the season, the first season, I think. But no, a whole season has gone by and Halo remains a mystery. And the only time we ever see Halo is through those weird visions that Chief has that I don't really know what a fan of the games is meant to make of that. It feels like it's leaving way too much left unanswered. And I feel like the bare minimum is just like seeing Halo at the end of Season 1. I feel like throughout Season 1 we should have not only seen Halo, but have Chief land on Halo and do at least a portion of the first game. But there's people who will say, like, oh, well, the show doesn't have to be exactly like the games, okay? The show is doing its own thing. Well, I'm just, like, the show's still called fucking Halo, so, like, why can we not just at least see Halo at the very end of the first season of the show called Halo? And I don't expect the show to be exactly like the games. What I do expect, at the bare minimum, is for the storytelling to be as compelling, if not more compelling, than the games. And I'm sorry, but the games did a better job of telling a story than the television show has so far. I mean, like I said before, if you were to watch Halo Combat Evolved as a movie, like a string of cutscenes, and you made cutscenes out of the gameplay stuff, that would be a pretty efficient, straightforward action thriller with an appropriately zigzagging, interesting plot. And that would be a much better film or season of television than Halo Season 1 was. And that's just Halo 1. I mean, Halo 2 is much more superior, I think, not only to the television show, but the first game. Not that the first game is bad narratively. I think it's quite good. I love it. But Halo 2 took it to another level where it was so much more narratively enriched, because the alien side of things was getting fleshed out, and they have their own politics and their own hierarchy, and there's all sorts of bullshit that goes on even among human populations. And so introducing this idea that humans and aliens aren't really that different, and it's like introducing this idea of like, is fighting really the answer? Maybe this whole war is wrong and backwards, and we should be working together to accomplish some unified goal, whatever it is. I compare the games Halo 1 and 2 in my head, in a way, to the Godfather films. This might sound like a dumb comparison to a bunch of you, but because the Godfather films are held in such prestige, right? And the Halo's just a dumb video game, so whatever. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a dumb video game. I don't think it's a dumb story. I think there's a lot of value to the Halo story. And I think it is similar to the Godfather films in some aspects, particularly in the narrative structure of the two films. If you take the first Combat Evolved, right? Master Chief, it's just the story just follows him, basically. Elites are the bad guys. It's pretty one-sided, but it's an efficient story, well told. Godfather is similar in that Michael Corleone alone kind of frames the whole thing narratively. And then when you get to Godfather Part 2, it does this dual narrative thing between Michael Corleone in the 1950s and Vito Corleone, his grandfather, in the 1900s, the early 1900s. And you're seeing these two stories of living in America told from radically different periods in time, where the law was much different, almost non-existent in the case of the early 1900s, where, criminal prosecution and forensics weren't nearly as sophisticated as they ended up being in the 1950s, and even more so after that. But the point is that in The Godfather Part 2, the reason that movie gets elevated beyond the first part is because of the enrichment that is provided by the juxtaposition between those two narratives told side by side, right? And they are informing each other in real time and contextualizing one another in real time as you're watching the film. And it makes rewatches of the film more valuable, because you know things at the beginning going in that you didn't know when you watched it for the first time. And I have a similar feeling from Halo 2, when it all of a sudden decided to tell its story on the Master Chief side and the Arbiter side, right? And it's like they're both really compelling, interesting, respectable characters telling their stories from their points of view. And you're watching one sequence and it's being informed by the sequence from the other side that you just saw, right? And there's a dramatic irony that's happening. You know things that the characters that you're following don't. And the audience is aware of a much broader picture that involves both humans and aliens that the individual characters are not aware of on their own. And it's fascinating to watch that play out in a similar way that it's fascinating to watch the second Godfather movie. It's an example of ludonarrative dissonance actually not being a big deal. It's not always a deal breaker. Ludonarrative dissonance is that thing where the motives of the player and the motives of the character that you're playing as in a video game are not in alignment, right? So the character in cutscenes wants to do one thing, is in one emotional state, and then you gain control of the character, and all of a sudden you're leaping around, killing everything on the screen, and it doesn't make sense in a way that you couldn't fit that into a cutscene and have it all make sense. You know what I mean? But you can say that's the case for Halo 2 because you're aware that Arbiter is being lied to and is delusional, and you're being asked to play as him having this in mind, but knowing that Arbiter doesn't know as much as you do as an audience member at this point, right? So there is that dissonance there, but it doesn't matter because the storytelling is actually sophisticated enough to make it not matter. So it's an example of how ludonarrative dissonance is an important thing to consider, but it's not always a deal breaker, and it doesn't always ruin a game just because it's there. I mean, it's not really ever a deal breaker, I don't think. It's just a take it or leave it sort of thing. The cinematography throughout the first season was okay, I guess. Nothing special. Some scenes felt sloppy, where they would jump the axis. But sometimes they do that deliberately for effect, and it actually works quite well. For instance, when Chief, first of all, the axis, right? If you don't know, the axis refers to the line that you draw between two subjects, right? The two primary subjects in a scene could be two characters looking at each other, right? For example, you draw a line between the two of them. They're looking at each other. You draw a line there. And you decide, as a director, what side of that line you want to be on in terms of camera coverage, right? And when you pick one, you stick with it, typically, right? Because it's very clear for the audience where everybody is localized in that geographical space, right? It's just like, that guy's on the left side, that guy's on the right side, and it's like, if the camera is always on the same side of the axis, the geography of the scene is very clear. But it's not always a big deal. Like, for instance, if you start off this scene with like a wide shot that establishes the whole space and where all the characters are placed within that scene, then if you cut to closer coverage and you're jumping the axis, it's not as big of a deal, because even though you're jumping the axis and it's a little disorienting, the audience still understands where everybody is positioned because of the wider shot that made everything clear. So jumping the axis is really only a big problem if your coverage is all just like medium and close shots and you don't have any wide shots. It feels like the show in certain scenes jumps the axis in an undisciplined way, where the scene wasn't really well thought out in terms of blocking. But there's scenes where they take advantage of an axis jump and they do it deliberately in order for dramatic effect, right? So an example of that is when Quan and Chief are on the ship in the premiere episode, and Chief finds out that Quan, her mother was killed, or father, I think, one of her parents, maybe both of them, were killed by Chief as a part of some military operation. And Chief feels bad about it, presumably. And it does an axis jump. It's not like a cut, it's like a camera move. The camera tracks from one side of the axis to the other while staying on Quan rather. It's either on Quan or on Chief, but the camera tracks to deliberately jump the axis because it's meant to mirror a flip in the conversation where all of a sudden Chief is on guard. He's on the back foot, where it's like he realizes, oh, I've really wronged this person, but I was just doing what I was told to do. The point is, the axis jump reflects character knowledge that has turned the tone of the conversation from one thing to another. So sometimes you do that deliberately to great effect. I feel like there was a bunch of times where they did it because of sloppy directing. I didn't find the music that memorable, which was surprising, because the guy who did the music for this show is Sean Callery. And Sean Callery did the music for a show called 24, and he did a terrific job with the score in that show. It's one of those shows where it's scored almost all the way through, almost like a Star Wars movie, in like a John Williams way, where almost every beat has like a musical affection applied to it, and it really like enhances the storytelling, especially in the case of 24. So, and he did such a good job of that. It's like, if you want music for your action television show, Sean Callery's the guy. That's who you want. But his score didn't really stand out to me in this case. And there's a few like recognizable Halo motifs where you can recognize Marty O'Donnell's compositions, but I feel like there should have been more of that. Too much of it, I feel, sounded too generic, and then here and there were like recognizable motifs and stuff. Like if there was a Halo got mentioned, or you would see like a visual depiction of a ring. Going back to an earlier talking point regarding Chief being helmeted and taking his helmet off too much, and my feeling that the writers are afraid of keeping Chief's helmet on too long because they're afraid that the audience is going to lose connection with the character if they don't see his face. I think they're really underestimating the degree to which a helmeted character can convey emotion, because there are plenty of other ways that emotion is conveyed beyond just facial expressions, and I think actually the majority of it is not through facial expressions, which is why I think they're thinking about this wrong. The effect that I'm referring to is called the Kuleshov Effect, which is a thing in film that it's like a universal law. It's in film theory, it applies to all films, and it's something that applies to one of my own productions. So people who are watching this, who are fans of mine, are probably aware that I make a show called Arby and the Chief, which revolves around a couple of action figures who have come to life, and they interact with each other and other people, and Master Chief has a helmet, Arbiter has a face, but it doesn't move, obviously, because he's an action figure, and Chief is an action figure as well, but he is a figure of somebody who is wearing a helmet. In either case, even though you can see Arbiter's face, they are both inanimate in terms of what's going on their faces, right? So you can't tell by their faces alone what they're thinking. So I use a lot of other different devices, so to speak, to convey what it is they're feeling. One of them is puppeteering, another is music, another is cinematography. Not only how a shot is framed, but also the proximity of the camera to the subject, which is a measure of the emotional investment of the subject in whatever it is they are engaged with or looking at, right? So the closer the camera is to the subject, the higher emotional investment is implied in the thing that they're engaged with or looking at. The farther away the camera is, the less emotionally invested they are. The point being that there's more than just faces that tells an audience what a character is feeling, right? So a comment that I get frequently enough that it, stands out to me is that people will see faces painted on to the figures. And it's curious because it's interesting. Like, why is that happening? Why are their brains doing that? They're painting faces where there aren't faces. And it's because of this thing called the Kuleshov Effect. Their brains are trying to fill in the gaps to make sense of what it is they're seeing. So they're seeing these action figures bob around in shots that have a very specific duration. They are framed in a very specific way. They're contextualized in a story, an overall pattern that's going somewhere, that's guided by a theme or themes. There's music happening, and there's moods like achieved by lighting and such, and the color temperature of the shots. There's all these things feeding into how the audience should be feeling in a particular moment and what the characters are thinking. And it's not dictated by the faces, right? So it's frustrating to me to watch a show like Halo and to realize that the showrunners of this show don't even understand this basic thing about film. I don't expect just anybody to understand this about film, but I expect Hollywood veterans and showrunners of a television show to understand this thing about film. So the Kuleshov Effect is this experiment conducted by this guy. I think he was called Kuleshov, hence the name. He generated this example, this filmic example of this phenomenon, right? Where you have a guy who has a blank expression on his face. It's just like that. just nothing on his face. No indication of happiness, sadness, just kind of flatline expression. And he's staring at a thing. You don't see what it is because the cover is just on him. It's not the reverse shot. So, cut to the reverse shot, the thing that he's looking at, and in one variant of the example, it's a picture of a bowl of soup, right? And so, what's informing the audience of what the character is feeling is dictated by the juxtaposition of shots, right? Character has a flatline expression on his face, but intense, right? He's clearly captivated by what he's looking at, but it's unclear as to whether he feels happy or sad about it. But either way, it's intense because he's focused on it. You can see that in his face. And the thing he's looking at in the first variant of the example is a bowl of soup. And the audience infers that the guy is thinking, oh, wow, look at that bowl of soup. He's hungry because he's captivated by that soup. He wants to eat it, right? So what do you extract from this example? Well, in both variants of the same example, the facial expression on the guy is unchanging. It's the exact same expression. But the intent of the character, what the character is thinking and feeling, is totally different, and it's purely based on the reverse shot, what it is. If it's the soup, it's one thing. If it's the bike, it's one thing. So what ultimately is dictating what the audience projects onto the character they're looking at in terms of feeling and thought is the juxtaposition of the two shots. It has nothing to do with, almost nothing to do with the face. There's another example from Alfred Hitchcock, right? Who, his example is, it's a pattern of 3 shots. The first shot is him squinting because he's trying to get a good look at something. The second shot in the first variant of this example is he's looking at a woman nursing a baby in her arms. And it cuts back to Alfred, and who's like an old guy, right? And he stops squinting and he smiles, right? And so the audience looks at this pattern of 3 shots and they extract from this pattern that he's happy because he's observing that this infant is being cared for and it's wholesome. The second variant is same first shot, he's squinting, but this time the second shot is a scantily clad woman on the beach or something. She's like partially, like half naked, right? And then the third shot again is him smiling. And in this variant of the example, the audience is inferring that the guy is a creepy old man who's getting off on looking at a scantily clad woman. Totally different thoughts, intentions, emotions, but as opposed to the Kuleshov example, this Hitchcock example, in this example, he's smiling. He's going from squinting to smiling. And in both variants, he's doing the same facial expression. So what does that tell you? That the face isn't actually that important as people seem to think, as the showrunners of Halo seem to think, right? So what they don't seem to realize is that you can convey a lot of emotion without having to see a face. It can be in body language, in shot composition, in music, in lighting, in juxtaposition. There's a lot of different things feeding into what emotions the audience is projecting onto the characters that they're looking at. The Halo series, I think, neglects this by having Chief take off his helmet in moments that make no sense, right? Where it would be more practical to have the helmet on, not only for protection, but for the diagnostic data that is obtained while the helmet remains on. And the games understood this. And particularly in the remasters of the cutscenes of Halo 2. So eventually Halo 2 had an anniversary edition that was released, and it had remastered cutscenes made by the studio Blur that made... did they do Halo Wars? I can't remember. I think it might have been them. But they're just amazing at making cutscenes. And there is a scene in Halo 2 that is my favorite. It's my favorite cutscene, and it takes place on High Charity. And not only is it my favorite cutscene in that video game, and even beyond just Halo, it's one of my favorite things in anything that I've ever seen. And it's just the way it's all shot and put together. It's just terrific. The scene is on High Charity, which is like the Covenant base of operations. It's like a mobile fortress. And Chief lands on it, and he's trying to stop the flood, and he's trying to stop the Prophet of Truth from activating the Halo array. And he's like trying to catch up with him. But he sees the Prophet of Mercy on High Charity, and he's being attacked by this parasitic flood form. Chief always has his helmet on, as you know, in the games. He doesn't take it off. I mean, he does at the end of Halo 1, technically.
It's finished.
No. I think we're just getting started.
There's a few instances where you can see he takes the helmet off, but you don't see his face, which is the important detail, right? He says in this appropriately callous way, "Your pal, where's he going?" in that iconic Steve Downes voice, and he does that so well. The Prophet of Mercy is only named Mercy by name. He doesn't actually show anybody any mercy. He's actually quite ruthless, as are the other prophets. They don't really care about life, whether it's human or Covenant. They're selfish, you know. But he's called the Prophet of Mercy, even though he hasn't really shown any examples of demonstrating mercy. But Chief actually shows the Prophet of Mercy by peeling the flood form off of Mercy. It's attacking Mercy, and Chief yanks it off him. I can't remember whether he lives or dies after that. But he does it to like spare him the pain of being attacked by this thing. And it's quite a poetic moment, because the Prophet of Mercy is being attacked by this flood form. It has its tentacles wrapped around his neck. And even in that intense situation of this parasitic life form strangling the life out of you, and getting this up-close look at what your ideology is really manifesting, right? This idea of the great journey, right? The Prophet is getting a cold, hard look at what the end game of this ideology really is, but he's still entranced by his ideology nonetheless, and he's not even willing to acknowledge that he's being attacked by this thing. This is the result of his beliefs, and he's not even willing to look at the ugliness of it, even when it's literally strangling the life out of him actively. He's still ignoring it, and he's still deluded, which speaks to the dangers of ideological possession, which is what I really like about it. It does those things that really good movies and TV shows do, where it finds a little moment of poetry in an organic little moment like that, right? It has something profound to say in just a tiny little realistic, relatively, or relatable beat.
Your pal. Where's he going?
Earth, to finish what we started. And this time, none of you will be left behind.
And so Chief pulls it off him, and then he goes over to Cortana, and Cortana tells Chief that the Prophet of Truth is getting away. He's going to the Ark to activate all the halos, and that as part of a tactical plan of action, Cortana wants to stay behind and let Chief go and chase truth. Cortana is going to stay on High Charity, and she is going to be in proximity of this giant UNSC ship, I think called In Amber Clad, and it has a reactor, much like the Pillar of Autumn had a reactor that was blown up at the end of Halo 1. They're going to do the same plan here as kind of a fail-safe. If Chief doesn't make it to truth in time, Cortana, as a last protective measure, can detonate the reactor in Amber Clad and destroy High Charity, because that'll stop truth. I can't remember exactly how. It's been a while since I played it, but the emotion of it is so effective, and you don't see Chief, his face, at all. It's all just playing off his helmet, and you're just looking at his helmet in various different composed shots, and they last for different durations of time, and the shot reverse shots are slightly different because it'll be one shot on Cortana, for example, will be closer than another one because it's actually moving in for closer coverage for an emotional reason. Like, for example, it cuts to a really close shot on Cortana's face the moment that she tells Chief that she needs to stay behind, and because she knows that her giving Chief that piece of information is going to affect him, because she knows that he cares about her, she cares about him, and Chief is now going to come face to face with the idea for the first time of leaving her behind, and he may not ever see her again. The next shot is a extreme close-up on, maybe not extreme, but a close shot on Chief, dead center on his face, and the reflection on Chief's visor is completely filled by Cortana's face. And that's telling you what's in his mind. It has nothing to do with his face. The reflection alone tells you that all that's on Chief's mind right now is Cortana, and he doesn't want to leave her behind, and his gaze is fixed on her, and there's a UNSC ship that crashes behind him that has a bunch of flood forms on it, but in that moment he doesn't care, even though it's a huge, like, force. I mean, imagine a plane crashing behind you. You would be incentivized to turn around and be like, what the fuck is going on, right? He's not even doing that. He knows the ship is about to crash behind him, but he's looking, his gaze is fixed on Cortana, and you can tell his body, if you look carefully at his body language, his body is turning in the direction of the ship crashing, but his gaze is fixed directly on Cortana, because that's where his emotional investment is in that instance, is that, oh shit, I'm going to have to leave Cortana behind for the first time, and I may not ever see her again after this. This might be it.
That brute has the index. And Miranda and Johnson. He can activate the ring.
If he does, I'll detonate in Emberclad's reactor just like we did the Autumns. The blast will destroy this city and the ring. Not a very original plan, but we know it'll work. No, I don't want to chance a remote detonation. I need to stay here.
And that's profoundly emotionally affecting for him, because Cortana is one of the few things in Chief's life that keeps him emotionally grounded. Ironically, her being a computer simulation of a person, but she is human enough to keep him grounded. And that kind of speaks to one of the other themes I really like about Halo, like the creation of the Cortana system, right? It's based off of Halsey, but it's not exactly like Halsey. It appears there are some anomalies in the manifestation of Cortana that were not intended by Halsey or the process of creating the system, but they manifested themselves anyway, and those quirks that are a part of Cortana's personality help Chief in his ends of his motivations, his intentions of saving the universe. Like, it all works out, and you have to wonder where do those anomalies come from? If it's not from Halsey, is it maybe divine intervention that's playing into the creation of AI? That somehow something divine in the cosmos has interfered with the creation of the Cortana program to give her these quirks that make her an integral part of Chief's effort to save humanity, right? Anyway, the point is, the games do this incredibly well, where they extract a lot of emotion out of this character that has a helmet on 100% of the time, or you at least don't see his face 100% of the time. And you don't need to, because the emotion is conveyed in other ways besides the face. And I feel like the show could have done that, but I feel like either, Pablo's FaceTime got in the way, where it's like he probably insisted that the audience see his face to some degree, or maybe it's not that. I'm inclined to say more that it's the writers who are deciding, like, oh well, if the audience can't see his face, they're not going to connect to him. So let's just have him take his helmet off a bunch of times, and even in moments where it makes no sense or it puts him or others around him in danger. And it was also wrong of them, if this is the case, it's wrong of them to think that there's nothing of cinematic or narrative value to extract from the games that could have been transferred over to the television show. I think if you're going to do something different, it doesn't have to be like the games, like I said, but if you're going to do something different, make it as good or better in terms of the storytelling. If not, just stick to what the games have done, because, you know, it's a safe path, arguably uninteresting, but at least it works. Like, there's a bunch of narrative beats in the games that are way more memorable than anything the show has done so far. Like in the first Halo game, for instance, where Chief finds Jenkins' helmet at the base of the facility where the Flood are stored, and it's like a legit horror movie beat where he's going through this old footage and he sees the last moments where the UNSC soldiers were alive before they were attacked by the Flood. You see the Flood on the video footage, and then it cuts back to Chief, and you're in his shoes again, and then it's like quiet, eerily quiet, and it's like, oh shit, but you can hear like something's going on, something's coming, and then the Flood pour in through all the different doors in the room, and then you're forced to like hightail it out of there and get out, fight your way out, basically. And it's a great horror movie beat. Or the beat near the end of Halo Combat Evolved where Foehammer comes to pick Chief up, and you think like that's going to be your ticket out of there, but then Foehammer gets shot down by Covenant Banshees or something, and her ship crashes, so she dies trying to pick you up. That's no longer a viable way out of there.
Cortana to Echo 419. 2 Covenant Banshees are approaching on your 6. Evade. Say again, evade. I'm hit. Mayday. Mayday. Airport buses are shot to hell. I can't hold her. I can't hold on.
Echo 419! She's gone.
It kind of leaves you as a player going like, oh shit, what do I do now? And then Cortana's like, wait, there's a Pelican, or I forget the name of the ship that's in the landing bay or whatever that you're supposed to go to, but there's like a ship that you can pilot that's still there, and there's still time to get there, but you have to go now. And then the player's just like, oh shit, I still have a chance to make it out of here. And it's like a cool way of integrating that narrative beat of like all hope is lost, but no, wait, there's still a chance sort of thing. In having that entirely in gameplay, it doesn't even cut to a cutscene for that. That's all just in real time without cutting to a cutscene. And you drive down before the time runs out, and it's epic. And it's way more memorable than the show. And the games did a better job of telling a story, man. So the reception of this show, people seem to overall not approve, I don't think. I mean, I know there's a bunch of bullshit headlines coming out saying Halo is a hit and it's very popular with Paramount, and I'm sure it is, but you can't confuse popularity and gross revenue with the quality of a show. Because Transformers, for instance, was the #1 box office movie, right? But Transformers kind of sucks. I thought Bumblebee was okay, but I'm not really talking about that. And it's just like they're all ranked #1 in terms of box office revenue, but that doesn't mean they're any good. It just means people flock to the theater to see it. But Halo is doing well for Paramount. Paramount is lacking in its library. And Halo has apparently done well for them financially in terms of attracting attention to their service. And I think there's enough interest in them greenlighting a second season. Like, they see that there's a financial incentive to do that. Like, people will at least stick around for a second season. I'll watch a second season purely out of curiosity, but I'm not as invested as I was at the beginning of season 1. You know, I had high hopes, and then I was just like, it's not really what I wanted. So now I'll watch season 2 still, but it's just like I don't have much faith in it. Like, I'm willing to have my mind changed. I hope they improve season 2, but I just don't have a lot of faith in it, particularly since I think at least one of the showrunners left. But maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. Maybe the guy who takes over, or the people who take over, will be better at it. But I don't know. We'll see. So the television showrunners and 343, I guess, have agreed on this thing where the game timeline is the gold timeline and the television timeline is the silver timeline. Hence why the Spartans are called Silver Team, partly at least. And I just think that's a funny choice of words. Like, why would you use those terms that are so concretely associated with, like, ranks and medals? You know what I mean? It's like, are you saying the silver timeline is inherently inferior to the gold timeline? You know what I mean? Like, because gold's first place, silver's second place. I don't know. It just seems like an odd set of labels to use. Like, when presumably you're not trying to rank one above another one. I mean, maybe it is appropriate because clearly the games are better, but I don't think that's what they were going for. I'm curious what the meeting looked like between the showrunners and 343 Industries, and also 343's handling of the Halo property overall, which is troubling to say the least. And but that's a whole other thing. I don't really want to get into that. There's one thing I found interesting regarding a Variety interview that was done. I think Variety magazine interviewed the showrunners, Stephen Kane, I think. Stephen was quoted by Variety as saying, "We didn't look at the games." And this, like, went public, and then it pissed off a bunch of fans because they were just like, what, you're show running the Halo IP, the television series, and you didn't even look at the games? Are you fucking kidding me? Like, Halo was designed to be a first-person shooter first and foremost, so it's kind of a slap in the face that you wouldn't at least consider the games when you're writing the story for the television show. So there was this big stink, and then the showrunner that was interviewed came out on Twitter and responded to the Variety article saying, "Headlines are fun, but here's what I really said. We started with the games, and then we went to 343, and they showed us all the lore, and then we wanted to gather as much information as we could from them in order to give you the full Halo experience." I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically what was said. And he seemed to be suggesting that Variety had deliberately misquoted him, like they made a false quote of what he said. And I don't think Variety would do that. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think Variety would take that risk in making up a lie about what somebody else said that they were interviewing. And it just seems like damage control. Like, I think they realized that it was a mistake for them to neglect the games as much as they did, and then they decided to do some damage control and try to make it seem like it was Variety's fuck up instead of theirs. But I don't know. I'm just speculating. I don't know what happened. I'm not shitting on the showrunners, except for the flawed execution of the show. I think it could have been done a lot better, but whatever. It is what it is now. Season 1 is done, and I am largely underwhelmed, and I will tune in for Season 2, but I don't have high hopes, and I still think the games are narratively superior. So, in conclusion, I think the Halo television series, Season 1, is one of the shows of all time. It may even be the most show ever made. Out of all the shows that have ever existed, Halo is certainly one of them, without a doubt. I rate it great out of 8. Just kidding. I rate it Halo Infinite out of 10. Oh, you want a real score, do you? Well, on a scale of cringe to based, I rate it somewhere between oof and yikes. What's next in the adventures of robot John Halo? Kinda makes you